Today, we're very proud to present how ANSI ISEA 121 forever changes at height safety. This Safeopedia webinar has been made possible by Ergodyne, a preferred manufacturer member of Safety Network. Safety Network demands excellence, so demand Safety Network. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you today's presenter, Nate Bohmbach. Nate oversees Ergodyne's prevention pillar of products, where he's dedicated to keeping worksite tools and equipment organized, efficient, and safe. His passion for at-height safety solutions includes the emerging category of objects at heights. He's developed innovative safety products for over a decade now and teaches best practices to multiple industries. He sits as chair for the ISEA Standards Committee for Dropped Object Solutions and represents Ergodyne's membership to NATE, the National Association of Tower Erectors, and DROP's Dropped Object Prevention Scheme. I now invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation. With that, Nate, please take it away.
Hey, thanks, Jamie, and thanks for everyone for joining us. Big thanks to Safeopedia and SafetyNetwork.me for allowing us to be on today. And again, thanks to everyone for joining us all over. We're going to jump in today and discuss dropped objects in general, but more specifically dive into the ANSI ISEA standard for dropped object equipment, ANSI ISEA 121. So as I mentioned, we're going to kick it off with a dropped objects overview and kind of tee up the subject for everybody. I'm sure, as everybody is well aware, and that's why you're joining today, this is one of the most talked about subjects in safety these days. So we hope to shed some light on what's going on and what you can do about it. We'll then dive into what we're calling solution evolution and how the various different solutions for dropped objects have evolved over the last couple decades and how they will evolve going into the future. And that ties in nicely to ANSI ISEA 121 and why it was created and what it means for you. And then if you joined us last year, we talked a little bit about starting and managing a drops program at your job. So we'll review a little of that on the heels of this discussion, and then we'll wrap it up with a conclusion and some Q&A. Feel free to drop your questions into the questions area in GoToMeeting. Jamie will be helping to manage those, and we'll probably pause a couple times throughout the presentation to take some of those questions. And we'll take as many as we can in the allotted time period at the end of the presentation to answer those as well. So here we go. So to frame this up, we throw this graphic up when we do a lot of our trainings to put it in perspective in terms of where dropped objects fits in your safety program. And what we like to point out is all safety managers these days, or at least most of them, are doing an excellent job focusing on workers at heights, which is the left side of this spectrum, right? And underneath workers at heights, you look at what kind of safety risks are apparent on the job. And the first thing that comes to mind is obviously fall protection when you're talking about working at heights. And everybody knows just how much fall protection has evolved over the last 30 years. And it continues to evolve every year going forward. But another thing that's evolving, and some things that tend to be kind of standard issue in the forms of your everyday PPE, like gloves, hard hats, eyewear, those types of things. Now that people have been using those at heights for many years, those types of things are evolving as well. A classic example that's gaining a lot of focus is the hard hat, for example, how the hard hat is evolving when being used at heights. You see different versions of climbing helmets and things like that taking center stage now when people are going to heights. So it's these classic forms of PPE that are being redesigned or re-looked at when it comes to those being used at heights. And then, of course, you're trying to figure out how to get workers to and from heights safely. So whether or not there's lifts in place, ladders, rope access, those types of things. So again, when doing work at height, the workers at heights themselves have been looked at under the microscope for the last many decades. But what's been an afterthought is the right side. And the right side is all the objects that are being used at heights. And Ergodyne, we term it objects at heights management. So The key here is if you look at the objects at heights and take care of those, you're ultimately on the hierarchy of controls better protecting workers in many ways. And just like fall protection comes to mind first when you talk workers at heights, the first thing that comes to mind when you talk objects at heights is dropped object solutions. So that's what we'll spend the majority of the time on here today. But other categories of safety under the objects at height spectrum include housekeeping solutions, which, just like standard issue PPE, can often be overlooked when it comes to working at heights and the different challenges and different levels of risk poor housekeeping can take on when being done at height. And then, just like getting workers to and from heights with access solutions, you also have equipment transportation challenges and concerns. And that's where you have lift plans put in place, or whether or not you carry equipment versus hoisting it up. So our focus today will be on the dropped object conversation. But when looking at this and getting into next week's safety stand down, you're going to want to look at this holistically and look at every different section when you're looking at a complete safety at heights plan. The next area we want to talk about is we want to differentiate objects at heights and dropped objects from fall protection, because even though our overall goal is to prevent humans and objects from falling, a lot of people and a lot of manufacturers out there like to talk about these two things in the same conversation and often look at dropped object solutions as an accessory to fall protection. And we don't look at it that way. We think it's a very front of mind safety topic and has a lot of specific concern and specifics that differentiate it from fall protection. So even though you have to look at it together, you also have to look at them separately in order to effectively manage them. And some of the key differences include, number one, who's at risk. So when you're talking fall protection, we often tell people you don your harness to protect yourself, you tie off your tools to protect your comrades on the job site. So it's the people below that are going to get struck by those objects who are most at risk. Whereas fall protection, it's the person putting the fall protection on, protecting themselves. So that's number one. Next is the sheer number of tools being used on the job site versus the number of workers on the job site. It depends on trade, but if you want to give it a guess, you might think that for every worker, there's 6 to 12 to sometimes 18 different tools that they're using. And how do you effectively prevent all of those tools from falling? Not to mention all the equipment, the structure, the debris that's around the worker as well. Next, kind of on the heels of that bullet, is even though we're all different shapes and sizes, we could all put on the same 5-point harness in different sizes perhaps, and maybe a couple different D-ring configurations in order to effectively keep us from falling in a fall arrest situation. But there is no universal harness for your tools, whether you're talking about small hand tools versus large power tools versus communication devices and instrumentation. There's not one 5-point harness that can be strapped on to every tool that's being used. So that makes it extremely challenging to effectively connect to those tools and tie them off. The next is that humans are on different ends of the system. So people might raise an eyebrow to that. What do you mean by that? Well, the key here is the human in a tool tethering situation most times is now the anchor point, whereas in a fall protection or fall arrest scenario, that individual is on the end of the system. They are the item, for lack of a better term, that ends up falling. Well, now the human is the anchor point, and that anchor point isn't a fixed anchor point because it's the worker. So if something falls, energy can travel up that lanyard and have force and pull on the worker. So there's different solutions out there you might want to consider that help manage that and help you better tie off to people. There's also a wider variety of industries with falling object risk. So people that have falling objects and dropped object concerns might not be in fall protection. They might be in industries that have work that's on the ground, and it might be an FOD or an FME situation. So a number of industries come to mind. And then finally, it's the damage to equipment that occurs. We are using more expensive equipment to get the job done these days. It's not just a simple pair of pliers that you're using. It's massively expensive meters and test equipment and structure that's being worked on. So all together, all of these bullets create an atmosphere that differentiates dropped object safety from fall protection safety, even though they are still talked about in the same conversation. So let's look at the numbers for a moment. So in 2017, there were just over 500 fatalities from being struck by an object or equipment that is other than a motor vehicle. So this does not include highway incidents and struck by motor vehicles. This is struck by a flying or falling object. Of that 503, 237 of them were fatalities were caused by a falling object. Now, thankfully, that number has trended down from 255 and 245 in earlier years. So we're moving in the right direction, and hopefully all of you on the line, because you're thinking about dropped object safety, are reasoning for that. But there's still a lot of work to do. In terms of non-fatal injuries, there were nearly 46,000 people hurt but not killed by being struck by a falling object in 2017. So these numbers kind of strike you, and you realize just how big they are, because they make up over 5% of all workplace injury. And I should note that these are only reported injuries. I can't tell you how many times our team is out in the field and we have somebody come up to us and say and give us their story about being hit by a dropped object. And well, was it reported? Well, no, I didn't want to report it. So there's tons that go unreported. And to put a dollar figure to that amount, if you take that 237 number in terms of fatalities and multiply it by the estimated $1.45 million it costs companies for a fatal accident, you can do the simple math and come up with the $344 million that it costs companies in the United States for falling object fatalities. So let's take a quick pause and do a quick poll, if we can, and find out if you've had any incidents on the job. So the question here, and all of you can participate, have you or anyone in your organization had a dropped or falling object incident? And you see the various different answers there. So please, we'll take a few seconds for you to lock in your answer here, and then we should be able to see what the result is. Oh, okay, there's the results. Jamie, if you don't mind recapping them, it's a little small on my screen.
The most at 49% is no, not yet, so that's great. 31% came in at yes, but as a near miss, thankfully. 18% at yes, resulting in equipment damage, and then 20% yes, resulting in an injury. So that's 1/5 that has an injury.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, absolutely. That's pretty substantial, and that did allow you to answer more than one too. So that's why, if you were doing the quick math, it added up to more than 100. But yeah, and I would say to the 49% too, I would question, whether or not they were reported, because they definitely they're happening and not being reported a number, often enough. But as you could see, a good majority of people did have some type of incident, which is probably why everyone's on the line today. So thanks everyone for participating in that. So next, let's talk a little bit about standards, and let's demystify something right out of the gate. The myth here is that there is no regulation for dropped objects, so we don't have to do anything about falling objects. OSHA doesn't say we have to do anything about falling objects. Well, that is not true at all, in fact. OSHA does mention the duty to protect your employees from falling objects in multiple locations in both the construction standard and the general industry standard. So you see there are various different sections in the construction standard, the scaffolding section, fall protection, steel erection, where they do talk about falling object protection and having requirements to do something. And then in general industry, under the walking working surfaces rule, which was recently updated, talking about climbing with equipment safety and the duty for employers to provide protection for employees exposed to both fall and falling object hazards. So the key here is, yes, it is law that you have to do something about falling object risk. But the problem is, and like most oftentimes, there's no roadmap, or they don't necessarily specify how you should do or what you should do about it. And that's where kind of the general duty clause and the gray area, if you will, comes into play. And we're gonna walk through that here shortly. So before we get into that, just pause and remind you to get your questions in. And I don't know if there's any questions that have come up yet.
Yeah, Nate, we've got a few here.
Okay.
So we'll just take a couple minutes if you don't mind. Selma asked a question. She says, what's being done in other countries in terms of regulations for dropped objects? Great question.
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Selma. Well, the key here is that the US is almost, until the 121 standard came out, which we'll talk about, was a bit behind in that regard. The United Kingdom, Australia specifically, those two countries have a little bit more detail in their regulations regarding the necessity to protect people from falling objects. And Canada mentions too, in a few areas in their standards and their health and safety standards, the duty to protect against falling objects. But again, I think the key commonality between all of them is that there isn't really a roadmap to tell you exactly what you need to do about it. So it's kind of left to what's reasonable best practice. And now, as you will see in the future here, and I'll save it for the 121 conversation, there is a formal guidance that does help you in terms of what to do. So I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Great, thanks, Nate. There's one here from Sharian, and Sharian asks, how do the new standards change the previous enforcement guidelines according to OSHA?
She's stealing a little bit of our thunder here. I will actually, I'll save that and keep it in my mind as we get into the future sections, and we'll kind of show you how those tie together.
Yeah, appreciate that. And this one may be the same. So last question, and then we'll let you get going. Scott asks, are there any tools that can't be tethered, and what do you do if they can't be tethered? Maybe a little more thunder stealing.
Well, there's new tools coming out every single day, so that from a manufacturing standpoint, that gives us job security, but it also creates a big challenge. So the short answer is yes, there's tons of tools that are coming out constantly that are challenges to tether, but we're coming up with more solutions every day to try to tether those tools. And I will touch on that very, very lightly a little bit later on.
Awesome. All right, thanks, Nate.
Thanks, and keep those questions coming in, everyone. Thank you for those. So let's talk about how the solutions have evolved in the last few decades. And we're talking to a highly educated safety group here. So many of you have recognized this graphic. It's the hierarchy of controls. And as a quick reminder, the most effective category of solutions you can put into place is to eliminate or substitute that risk. And the least effective, your last resort, is PPE. So we're going to kind of redefine PPE and the rest of the hierarchy of controls when it comes to dropped objects. And let's start at the bottom and look at PPE when it comes to dropped objects. So PPE, the definition we kind of put in place is that it's a secondary protection. It creates a barrier on the worker. It does not prevent anything from falling. It only hopes to minimize the damage after something does fall and strike a person. So you think of classic examples, the hard hat, eyewear, steel toe boots, so on and so forth. But you look at how long some of these solutions have been around, and you consider that the first pair of safety eyewear was invented back in 1914. The first hard hat was invented in 1919, and I want to pause and give a congratulations for the hard hat for having its 100th year birthday. Joining the Century Club, the hard hat in 1919, and then steel toe boots were invented back in 1930. So PPE for falling objects has been around for a long time. So basically, since Newton got hit on the head with an apple and we realized gravity existed, is when we first realized that dropped objects could be a concern. So moving up the ladder to administrative controls. Administrative controls are just that. They're admin controls that help adjust or change people's behavior to help minimize risk. So anything from awareness materials, signage, things like that, to training to get people to think about it, and then barricading or directing people in the forms of caution tape in hopes that they don't cross under that barrier. But if you look at PPE and administrative controls, really the only two things for the better part of a century that people have used to protect people against falling objects, you look at the effectiveness of PPE in terms of the hard hat, and not to rag on the hard hat celebrating its 100th birthday, but a hard hat only helps you if that item falls directly on your head. If you happen to be bent over, or it hits you in the shoulder, or if it falls from a great distance and it's a heavy object, the hard hat only helps you so much. Also, from an administrative control standpoint, you take a look at barricading or creating caution tape around the job site, and many people know how easy it is for an item to deflect outside of that barricaded zone. And there's calculations you can put in place that tell you if something hits, how far it can skip with still great force outside of that barricaded zone. So the takeaway here is that PPE and administrative controls don't prevent anything. They just hope to protect you in some situations. So in comes engineering controls. And there are forms of engineering controls that have been around for a little while. And engineering controls in this conversation, they aim to prevent objects from falling in the first place, or at least falling very far. So we differentiate two types of engineering controls. Passive engineering controls that are installed and don't require active participation from the worker during the job, and then active engineering controls, which do require the worker to use throughout the job. So if you compare it to fall protection, a passive control in fall protection is a guardrail, right? It's installed and it's helping prevent a fall, but the worker isn't actively working with it. And then active controls are fall protection systems like anchors, body support, and connectors, okay? So as we go into passive controls, there's two big types of passive controls that have been around for a while. The first is perimeter netting and netting to help prevent things from falling or to catch debris if things do fall. But netting is not exactly something that can be thrown up and taken down quickly. It's expensive. It requires a qualified person to install. And when you're installing it, all of those components have the risk of falling, right? So in short, perimeter netting is expensive and time consuming. Then you have toe boards. Toe boards are the one thing that OSHA does mention, but toe boards can be misleading as well. And I would argue it even encourages poor housekeeping. So you think, oh, I have a rail in the form of a toe board around my scaffolding. I'm just going to keep all my stuff inside of it. So now you have trip hazards and poor housekeeping present. And guess what? If you drop something while you're using it, it can easily strike the platform and bounce right over the toe board. So these two solutions have their flaws as well. So in come active engineering controls. And drum roll, please, the first form of tethering, the duct tape and rope. So for a long time, this system has been the first active engineering controls out there and probably the most widely used. But guess what? Without a standard in place, who's to say what can be used and what can't be used? So let's look, I want you to think about it like this. Would you use the following systems? Well, duct tape and rope we hear every day. Why is this not good enough? Why can't I just put a piece of twine and duct tape it onto my tool and call it a tethering system? Well, I would suggest, well, why can't you just plasterize your baseball cap and put that on your head and call it a hard hat? Or probably the one that hits home the most is, why don't I just tie a rope around my waist and call it fall protection? So in 2019, duct tape and rope for dropped objects is what a rope around your waist was for fall protection back in the 1970s and early 80s, before the body belt then evolved into the full body harness. So this is the comparison. So if we frame it up on top of the hierarchy of controls, we wipe all these away and introduce to you engineering controls. And that's where ANSI ISEA 121 comes to be. All right. So let's jump into ANSI ISEA 121, and maybe we'll take some questions at the next section. So engineering solutions now have come to be very common, but really there's nothing to differentiate an engineered solution like you see in the photographs to a makeshift solution like duct tape and rope. There's been nothing formal to differentiate the two. So coming up on almost a year here this summer, ANSI ISEA 121 was adopted officially by ANSI. So it's available at safetyequipment.org through ISEA, and you can purchase it. I think it only costs $30 US or something like that. And so ANSI ISEA 121 is the standard for dropped object prevention solutions. So it includes the active controls that we discussed, the first category being anchor attachments, and the second category being tool attachments. So these are retrofit attachment points that can be applied to an anchor point like a belt or a structure, or to the tool. So they're subsequent to the manufacturing of that anchor or that tool. More on that in a second, and this should get back to that first person's question. Then you have tool tethers, which is the tool lanyard that connects the tool to the anchor point. And then finally, you have containers, which are either stationary or portable, things like hoist buckets, tool pouches, tool bags, things of that nature. So these are the four categories that make up the initial standard, the ANSI ISEA 121-2018. This standard will address things like design criteria. For example, it requires locking gates on connectors, carabiners, and whatnot. It will address testing criteria, so that's for us manufacturers, into what kind of safety factors, how far do we need to drop them, what conditions do we need to drop them in, for example, and how they need to perform during those tests. And then also requirements for us as manufacturers on how we report on those results, and then subsequently how we label and provide instructions on those products. And in the appendices, they touch a little bit on the how to use it and what's best practice in terms of using it. So some key things, some key exclusions of the standard include how the equipment should be used. For example, the standard's not going to tell you how much weight a user can tie off to their body. That's one of the #1 questions that comes up. The manufacturers will make a recommendation, and I think most manufacturers do suggest 5 pounds is the limit, but it doesn't cover that. It also won't cover any PPE They're separate standards that have been around for a long time in terms of hard hats. Won't cover passive controls like toe boards or netting, and it doesn't get into, even though hoist buckets are considered containers, it doesn't get into any material handling or hoisting and lifting operations or anything like that. The other thing it doesn't include is the tools themselves. So it is essentially the retrofit system that connects the tool to the anchor point. So in our example on the screen, and hopefully this covers the individual's question earlier, that hole that is manufactured into that spud wrench is not considered applicable in the ANSI ISEA 121 standard. That doesn't mean that that manufacturer can't test to the standard. It just means they can't market and call it an ANSI ISEA 121 compliant tool, because in its first iteration, tools are not part of the standard, okay? So now that that's been laid out, let's cover a couple questions that I know will come up and get some truth on that. Number one is, so ANSI ISEA, this will require or mandate employers to use tethering equipment. That's not technically true. ANSI standards are voluntary standards, but there may be a catch, and we'll touch on that here shortly. The next question that comes up is, will OSHA write a standard requiring the use of this equipment into their regulations? That's definitely a possibility, but there's no confirmation right now that OSHA is actively writing a standard on that. Well, then if you consider those two things, and the thing that comes to mind is, well, if OSHA isn't writing a standard, then I don't have to specify tethering on the job. Well, by the letter of the law, you may be right. However, this does set precedent for a best practice, and that's going to be the theme of the rest of the conversation. And it's easily implementable. So tethering systems are not difficult. Issuing tethering versus putting up perimeter netting, for example, it's not even comparable. What's easier to implement? So OSHA, it's my opinion that OSHA will recognize this. And then finally, the standard will give companies guidance on how to implement dropped objects. Well, the answer there is kinda, okay? It won't tell people when they have to use it. For example, you must have tethering above 6 feet, or how much weight you can tie off to the body or anything like that. But what it will do is tell companies and give them guidance on what types of equipment they should implement on the job. So hopefully that helps a little bit. So covering all that, everyone's saying, Nate, you know, you probably just confused me a little more in some situations. So what I want to spend some time on is, what does this mean for everybody, and how will this kind of snowball in the world of regulation and standards? So in speaking to that, let's look at this 4-phase approach, or this 4P approach. The first thing, if you dial back a little bit into the presentation, is that we talked about how OSHA does mandate that employers protect their workers from falling objects, but they don't specifically say how to do it, right? So falling object safety is required. The next is that you, as safety managers, there is absolutely no argument that preventing something is not a better practice than simply PPE and protecting them from it, right? So there's no argument that preventing an item from falling in the first place is not a better practice than protecting workers with just hard hats and barricades. And 121 as a standard formalizes this, and that's why we titled the presentation the way we did, is that's why it changes safety. ANSI ISEA formalizes tethering systems and containers, gets beyond duct tape and rope as equipment for prevention practices, and creates an established standard for organizations like OSHA to point to if something does come up. And the last thing, and probably the most important thing, is that a lot of you are already doing it. So the precedents there, major contractors, energy producers, suppliers, and other verticals are already implementing tethering. So it's the cool thing to do. And it's the thing that people are doing. So that in it of itself sets precedent for it to be a best practice. So summarizing, the standard represents the formalization of prevention as best practice in terms of tethering systems and containment. And it allows companies to implement 121 into their safety programs. So where you have in your policies, where you have tethering should be practiced, you can now write in, and the equipment used for tethering should meet the ANSI ISEA 121 standard. And there's already conversations from organizations like ANSI A10 and AGC and other and NATE, DROPS, organizations like that are embracing this and mentioning it. And this gives OSHA the potential to reference it under the general duty clause or write a letter of interpretation around the subject. The same thing happened when 3,600-pound gated snap hooks were required through ANSI. OSHA did not specifically write that into the regulations, but there was a letter of interpretation provided pointing to the Z359 standard for that. So in summary, again, I keep pounding it into your head, but is incredibly important is prevention is better than PPE. So we'll pause there for one moment and see, maybe take two questions, Jamie, if there are any questions that have come up before we get into the last part of our conversation.
Yeah, that's no problem. Let's see here. Al asks, do you believe tools will ever become part of the 121 standard?
I would say that that's definitely a possibility. I know Ergodyne and many others have been in conversations with tool companies. They're asking for advice and whatnot. And again, I encourage these tool companies to, if they're putting quote unquote tethering points into their tools, that they can certainly test around the parameters of this standard, even though they're excluded from the standard. But there's definitely, I think, some synergy that will happen down the road.
All right, and then let's see. Callie asks a question. What do you see the role of general contractors as? So specifically with when contractors are doing the at-heights work, how does that interaction take place with the general contractor?
I think it's a great question, and we could probably do a webinar just on that subject with a panel of experts, because I think it differs a little bit in terms of self-performance or non-self-performance. But I'm going to throw out the term role model in terms of getting into a program rather than just writing a policy. So I think the important thing for general contractors is to create a program and an atmosphere that encourages everybody to use dropped object prevention and tethering. And we all have to realize that we haven't conquered gravity for everything. So there are some things out there that you may just not be able to tether yet, but it's just best to do as much as you can, rather than just writing a policy saying all of the subcontractors on this job must do this, and then just leave that as a piece of paper out there. Bring in experts, hold training discussions, get your subs to learn about the risk, and see what's out there in terms of new product innovation to help tether, and really just create, again, I use the word program and be a role model for it. And I guess that kind of leads into our next section here quickly. Rather than, too many times you see these things fail because it's written into a policy and all the subs are just expected to follow it without any direction. Work together and hopefully as we continue to learn from a manufacturer all the way down to the person swinging the hammer, how to do this better. So it's super good question, and probably not a straightforward answer, but hopefully that it just gets people thinking and talking to one another. So, and I think that conversation can start next week, because next week, as many of you know, is a big week, at least specifically here in the U.S., for safety stand down week and standing down to prevent falls in construction. This has been an awesome campaign OSHA has put on the last few years, last 5 or so years now, I believe, to promote standing down and getting contractors to just take a break and talk about, I think traditionally when it started, specifically fall protection for people, but we encourage you to get fall protection for tools into that conversation as well. So implement dropped objects into your safety stand down conversations. I know our team is all over the place next week. Ergodyne will be putting on a ton of stuff out on the internet too to help people implement this into their conversations. So I think it starts there at least. Let's all make an effort beginning next week to really work dropped objects into the conversation. And really how you create a program, you know, continuing to riff off that question, I don't know if it's still available, but we did a webinar last year through Safeopedia specific to how to create a program. And this is just a quick review of the 8 steps, the 8-step roadmap in terms of how to create a program, from the call to action, which hopefully will start here today for many of you listening to the webinar, for all the way down to expanding it to your entire organization and to your subcontractors. Without getting deep into every step here, you know, look for that content or reach out to us if you'd like a recording of that webinar, because we can provide that as well.
Hey, Nate, we can just include it in the follow-up if that's all right with you guys, the on-demand version.
That's a great idea, Jamie. Yeah, good thinking.
Great.
The only unfortunate part is I think you have to listen to me and Jamie again, because we were the ones on that webinar. So apologies ahead of time for that. In terms of tools and support, there's a ton of digital resources available at Safeopedia and on our website. You know, anything from templates to help you create dropped objects within your JSAs, to toolbox topics and stuff like that, and webinars like we mentioned. And in terms of product trends, manufacturers are launching new stuff every day. And some themes that we're seeing amongst a lot of folks are easy retrofit attachments that don't require, you know, taping and shrinking and application of heat to attach to a tool, but also do not affect the integrity of the tool. So they'll either wrap around a tool or fasten onto a tool, but they do not require any type of welding or drilling or anything like that. So a lot of great one-step solutions. Also, a couple themes in terms of lanyards are, on one end, low profile options that are not going to impede people when they're doing their job. So things that sit tight to your hip or can retract back into a housing so they don't catch on things as you're climbing or working in confined spaces. And then shock absorbing lanyards, I mentioned before. These shock absorbing lanyards reduce the shock the body sees if a tool is dropped. So it's not going to have the potential to pull you down with it. And then containers in terms of pouches and hoist buckets that have lids on them and tethering points available. So you don't have to tether to your fall protection harness. You can tether to tethering points on these locations. Another product trend we're seeing out there is kitting. So there is a big systematic element to this in terms of, as we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, there's so many different tools out there, and there's not one universal harness for these tools. So the kitting of these solutions for example, an iron worker, there's a trade-specific kit that's available so that they don't have to go through all the complication of picking out everything. It's all available and packaged together in one thing for them. Okay, so just some quick product trends and areas of support that you can lean on to help you in your efforts. And so before we kick it back to Jamie to wrap up with 10 minutes or so, or 5 minutes of questions, just want to call out in summary here to say the times, they are changing, and that PPE and caution tape do not prevent dropped objects. So this is kind of a visual recap of our webinar. Passive controls can be expensive or misleading, and duct tape and rope are as archaic as wrapping a rope around your waist for fall protection, and are very unsafe. No one's tested that system that you see in that image. So what it all boils down to is engineering controls backed by a formalized ANSI standard in 121 to provide an unquestioned best practice, and paving the way really for dropped object safety and how it changes it in the workplace going forward into the years coming. All right, so with that, I'll say thank you now. A huge thank you for sticking with us, and hopefully this presentation was good for you. But with that, I will kick it back to Jamie and ask to see if there's any other questions out there.
Thanks, Nate. Yeah, they've been coming in fast and furious, so we'll get right at it. Got about 11 minutes till the top of the hour. So we'll kick it off with Anthony. Anthony asks, what's the best way to get my subcontractors to implement tethering on our project?
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah, to get ahead of it, I'd say, I guess it depends on where you're at in the project. But I think this is a wake-up call for people who are bidding on projects to get ahead of it and have the conversation prior to the awarding of the bid or right after the bid. But if the project is going on now, the tricky thing is the jobs are ever changing, right? So, by the time you get a certain set of subcontractors trained, you've already moved to the next phase of the project, because let's face it, you guys are good, and the work is being done quickly. So bring in some experts, have the conversation, and almost bring the leaders of those subcontractors maybe into a room and just say, hey, listen up, guys, we're going to do this. We're going to require tethering. We're not just going to write it on a piece of paper and just say good luck. Let's work together and maybe get an expert, the safety consultant, objects at heights manufacturer in the room to discuss it and figure out how best to go about it. And I think a good thing to do would be to check in on that how to implement a program webinar, and really start small with a specific sub or specific area on the job, and then expand from there. Get a couple workers' tools tethered up, have them go out and use it for a week, then come back and give their feedback. There's tools in place called a tool inventory sheet, where we can capture the solutions for every tool they're using and provide those recommendations. So in short, I'd say make it a team effort. Get together and figure out how you can do it, and then carry that with you, record all that, and carry it with you to future projects.
Great, thanks, Nate. Linda has a good follow-up question. Do you think, or can we include this in the contract?
100%. I mean, I guess I shouldn't be the one to say that. That's probably a question for the folks writing the contract, but I would say absolutely it could be put into the contract, and it has been done before. So short answer, I think is yes.
All right. Brian has a question. Brian asked this question during the registration process. So Brian asks, where does staging come into play with engineered prevention?
Staging, first of all, is a great practice if done properly, but staging kind of falls, it's kind of a hybrid of an administrative control and an engineering control, right? Because if staged appropriately, it's a prevention practice, but also staging itself is an engineering, or excuse me, an administrative control. So I would say look at that in terms of not just staging in terms of productivity, but also staging in terms of falling objects. So if something can be staged appropriately for the next step in the job, that it should also be considered, you know, in a proper location that doesn't create, or tied down, for example. So then it becomes not only an admin control, but also an engineering control.
All right, thanks, Nate. Here's one from David. It says, can you demo some devices? Oh, that's interesting.
But the short answer is absolutely. I would say if you have some safety stand down things teed up for next week, the chances are the folks coming out will have some demos available. I know the Ergodyne team does, and even if it's not live on the job site, check out the video section of our website too. Pretty much every single product we have has a demonstration video tied to it.
Yeah, I second that as well. The educational content on your website, Nate, is fantastic, second to none. So let's see here. All right, we have a question from Chowdhury. I think you covered this a little bit, but if you could maybe expand on it. Can we make some laws regarding falling objects? Something maybe fixed with the work to permit, which is mandatory before start of activity on height. So I think the question is really asking, you know, almost part of the, can we include it in the contract? Can we include it in the permit to work process? Great idea.
Yes, again, I'm probably not the best person to ask in that regard, but I will say, again, the pieces are in place here for that to happen, because we do have the requirement for falling object protection, but we don't have the specifics saying, well, what does that exactly mean? But now there's a formal standard because ANSI adopted 121 to point to. So all of the pieces are in place, and I do think the conversation is happening. So it's just a matter of how it evolves and really, in my opinion, kind of when it's out there.
Thanks, Nate. All right, quick follow-up question from Ruud. Can you clarify what is staging?
Well, I think it differs a little bit depending on the job and whatnot, but I think it's the location of materials and equipment around the job, on the job, you know, for, you know, productive workflow. And in terms of, and then safety has, I think, an effect on all that as well in terms of where things are located to create safe workflow. But the definition probably differs a little bit depending on trades and depending on job.
No, I think that's a great explanation. All right, looks like a couple more minutes. Robert might be the last question. If you have some thoughts about getting a question in, you better get it in. So Robert asks, you mentioned FOD and FME. What are those?
Good. I know the safety where the acronyms get thrown around really fast and furious, but it's a great question. So FOD, they're kind of the same, but it's different acronyms maybe used in different industries. But FOD stands for foreign object disposal or damage or debris, and FME stands for foreign material exclusion. And in short, both of them are really the management of foreign objects and materials so that they don't get into places they shouldn't. So industries like aviation, manufacturing, nuclear power, food processing, all of them have different programs, titled one of those acronyms to help prevent things from falling into sensitive areas or things like that. So again, and that's more on the damage side of things than it is necessarily on the safety side of things. Or could be both, I suppose.
Great, thank you, Nate. All right, it looks like that is it. Nate, any final words before we close out the webinar?
No, just another thanks to you, Jamie, and the team over at Safeopedia in really pushing this topic, because it is a massively confusing topic, and hopefully as it evolves, things will become more clear. And kudos to everybody on the line for tuning in, because that means that you are thinking of this and you are wanting to implement it or wanting to continuously improve when it comes to dropped object safety. So I just wish everyone a great stand down week next week. And please let us know if you have any other questions, or let us know how we can help you at all.
Thank you, Nate. Really, really appreciate it. I know you put a lot of work into this presentation and everything that's behind the scenes that you're doing to really help save lives. Those numbers are staggering. I talked to a few people even just after our rehearsal, and the sheer numbers of injuries and deaths and damage is astronomical, and seems like a common sense no-brainer thing, but we got to talk about it. So really appreciate you putting this all together. And Ergodyne, Al, you're out there somewhere. Really appreciate all your help with this, and really everybody over at Ergodyne Safety Network. Thanks again for your support. To me, most importantly, it's the audience. So we really appreciate the support and everybody signing on today. Without you, none of this would be possible or even make any sense. So really appreciate everything you're doing to help keep people safe. So with that, small reminder, we will be sending out a link to the recording and the presentation slides in just a few days. So everybody, have a great rest of the week and a great weekend. Take care and stay safe.